the last American who remembered the old world. What she told her family before dying 1953. There's a filing cabinet in the Library of Congress that contains the voices of dead Americans, not recordings, transcriptions. Thousands of pages of handwritten and typed interviews conducted between 1936 and 1940 by government writers who were sent into homes across 24 states with a single instruction: get their stories before they're gone. The program was called the Federal Writers Project, a branch of Roosevelt's New Deal that employed out-of-work journalists, novelists, and researchers to document the lives of ordinary citizens. They collected 2,900 life histories. Then they filed them in the Library of Congress, where they sat mostly unread for nearly 40 years. I found them because I was looking for something else. I was tracing architectural records from the 1870s, trying to understand why so many American courthouses and government buildings from that era feature proportions that don't match the people who supposedly used them. The same question I keep running into. But the deeper I went into those archives, the more I realized the buildings weren't the real story. The people were. Because those 2,900 interviews captured something no textbook ever could. The first-hand memories of Americans who were alive before everything changed, and what they described doesn't match the history we've been taught. Let me explain what I mean by before everything changed. Consider the math. An American born in 1855 who lived to 85, not unusual, would have died in 1940. That means they were alive, speaking, remembering when those government writers knocked on their doors. They would have been children during the 1860s and 1870s. They would have witnessed the most dramatic transition in American history, not gradually, not over centuries, but within a single lifetime. And their grandchildren, born in the 1920s and 1930s, heard their stories firsthand. Those grandchildren are the last generation that carries the oral history of the old world, and they're almost gone. Mary Kelly was born in 1851 in Southfield, Michigan. She lived to 113 and died in 1964. She was alive before the Civil War and survived long enough to see television in every American home. Maggie Barnes was born to a formerly enslaved woman in the early 1880s and lived to approximately 1115, dying in 1998 in North Carolina. These weren't extraordinary cases. The Gerontology Research Group has verified 16 supercentenarians born in the 1850s alone. Dozens more lived past 100. Hundreds lived past 90. An entire generation of witnesses whose memories spanned two completely different worlds. The government had the chance to record all of them. It recorded 2,900. Then it stopped. The project was defunded in 1939 after congressional hearings, turned over to state control, and effectively shut down. The interviews were boxed up, not published in any accessible form until the 1970s. 30 years of silence around the last first-hand testimony of Americans who remembered what came before. Before what, exactly? That's where October 8, 1871 becomes impossible to ignore. Every American learns about the Great Chicago Fire. Mrs. O'Leary's cow, the wooden city, the rebuilding. What almost no one learns is what happened the same night at the same hour across 3 states simultaneously. In Peshtigo, Wisconsin, a firestorm consumed the entire town in approximately 1 hour. Between 2,000 and 2,500 people perished, making it the deadliest wildfire in American recorded history. The fire burned 1.2 million acres. Survivors describe winds strong enough to lift adults off the ground, flames that moved faster than a person could run, and a heat so intense that people crossing open ground simply burst into flame without being touched by visible fire. Reverend Peter Pernin, the parish priest who survived by submerging himself in the Peshtigo River, published his eyewitness account in 1874. He described a phenomenon that doesn't match any normal wildfire behavior. The available oxygen was consumed so rapidly that people who showed no burns were found deceased, as if the air itself had been weaponized. The fire created its own weather system, a vortex of superheated wind that behaved less like a forest fire and more like something detonating from a central point outward. The same night, Holland, Michigan burned. Manistee, Michigan burned. Port Huron, Michigan was threatened. Across 225 million acres of the upper Midwest, fires erupted simultaneously. The National Weather Service confirms these fires broke out across 3 states at the same time on the same evening. The official explanation is drought, lumber debris, and a cold front with high winds. Reasonable, except for one detail that has nagged researchers since 1883: the simultaneity. In 1883, a hypothesis emerged that fragments of Biela's comet had struck the atmosphere and ignited the fires from above. This theory was revisited in a 1997 documentary and investigated again in 2004 by the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. Witnesses in Chicago reported blue flames burning in basements, a color consistent with unusual chemical combustion, not wood fires. The theory has never been proven. It has also never been disproven. But here's what matters for this investigation. The elderly Americans interviewed by the WPA writers in the 1930s were children in 1871. A 70-year-old interviewed in 1938 would have been 3 years old that night. An 80-year-old would have been 13, old enough to have watched the sky turn red, old enough to have been told by their parents exactly what happened. The Library of Congress describes those 2,900 interviews as containing tales of surviving the 1871 Chicago fire and pioneer journeys. But that description only scratches the surface. What else did those Americans remember? What did they tell the government writers about the night everything burned, and why was the project shut down before the full picture could emerge? The burning wasn't the only erasure. In 1890, the United States conducted the most comprehensive census in its history. For the first time, each family received an entire form. The census recorded immigration status, naturalization details, English language proficiency, home ownership, and Civil War service. 62.9 million Americans documented in unprecedented detail. It was also the first census for which the government broke from a century of protocol and did not require copies to be filed in local offices. Every previous census from 1790 to 1880 had local backups stored in county courthouses and state archives. The 1890 census existed in one location: the basement of the Commerce Department building in Washington, D.C. On January 10, 1921, a fire broke out in that basement. Approximately 25% of the records were destroyed outright. Another 50% suffered serious water and smoke damage. The investigation never determined a definitive cause. Theories range from a discarded cigarette to faulty wiring to spontaneous combustion of sawdust in the building's workshop. What happened next is more disturbing than the fire itself. The surviving records, perhaps half still usable, were moved to a warehouse. For 12 years, nothing happened, no restoration effort, no attempt to copy or preserve what remained. Then in December 1932, the chief clerk of the Bureau of Census sent the Librarian of Congress a list of documents scheduled for destruction. The 1890 census was on that list. The librarian was asked to identify any records worth preserving for historical purposes. He identified none. Congress authorized destruction on February 21, 1933. The next day, February 22, President Hoover laid the cornerstone for the National Archives building, the fireproof facility specifically created to prevent exactly this kind of loss. They destroyed the records one day before beginning construction of the building that would have saved them. Of 62.9 million names, roughly 6,160 survive. The single most detailed record of every American alive during the transition period, the people who remembered the old world, eliminated. Not by accident. By sequence: fire, neglect, bureaucratic process, authorized destruction. Each step plausible on its own. Together, they form something harder to dismiss. And then there were the children. Between 1854 and 1929, approximately 250,000 children were loaded onto trains in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia and transported to rural communities across the Midwest and West. The orphan train movement, organized primarily by the Children's Aid Society, founded in 1853 by Charles Loring Brace and later by the New York Foundling Hospital. At stops along the route, the children were displayed in what contemporary accounts describe as auction-like events. Farming families inspected them, evaluated their size and apparent health, and selected the ones they wanted. Many were taken to work fields. Less than half were actual orphans. The rest were children of immigrants, children of the poor, children whose parents couldn't afford to feed them or couldn't fight institutions that took them. An estimated 30,000 children lived on the streets of New York City in the 1850s alone. But here's the detail that nobody discusses. Upon arrival in their new communities, older children were strongly encouraged, sometimes required, to break all contact with their past. Names were changed. Origins were not recorded or were recorded inaccurately. The organizations that ran the program kept spotty records at best. Many children could not tell their own grandchildren where they came from because they genuinely didn't know. 250,000 Americans whose identities were functionally severed. An entire generation disconnected from their own history by institutional design. The timing is precise. The orphan trains ran from 1854 to 1929. The fires occurred in 1871. The giant photographs clustered between 1850 and 1900. Tartaria vanished from maps in the mid-1800s. The architectural transition from grand classical to simplified modern happened in the same window. And the 1890 census, the one record that would have documented every single person alive during this transition, was eliminated. Not coincidence. Pattern. Which brings me to 1893 and the buildings they don't want you to think about too carefully. The World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. 27 million visitors across 6 months. Over 200 buildings spread across 630 acres of Jackson Park. The White City. Official history tells us these massive neoclassical structures, enormous domes rivaling European cathedrals, columns and sculptural detail as precise as ancient Rome, were built in under 2 years from a mixture of plaster, cement and jute fiber wooden frames. Built with horse-drawn equipment, hand tools and manual labor, no cranes, no bulldozers, no modern construction technology, 200 buildings in 630 acres in under 24 months. And then, after 6 months of display, nearly every single structure was demolished. The only major building that survived is the Palace of Fine Arts, now the Museum of Science and Industry, preserved because it had been fireproof to protect the art collections inside. Everything else was torn down or burned. This pattern repeated. Paris, 1889, Buffalo, 1901, St. Louis, 1904, San Francisco, 1915. Build magnificent structures of impossible scale and detail, display them briefly, destroy them completely, every time. The elderly Americans interviewed in the 1930s remembered the White City. Some had visited as children or young adults. They walked through those buildings and saw something that looked nothing like the America being constructed around them. Something older. Something grander, something that felt less like a temporary exhibition and more like a city that had always been there. And then it was gone. Here's what I keep coming back to. There was a woman, there had to have been, in every county in America in the early 1950s. A woman born in the late 1850s, living past 90, sitting in a house surrounded by grandchildren who'd grown up hearing her stories. Stories about buildings that were already ancient when she was young, but that the textbooks claimed were built just years before. Stories about the night the sky turned red across 3 states. Stories about trains full of children heading west with no names, no families, no pasts. Stories about a world that operated differently than anything her grandchildren saw around them. A world of different proportions, different architecture, different knowledge. And when she tried to tell them, when she described what she remembered, they nodded politely and changed the subject. Because her memories didn't match the textbooks. And in 1950s America, the textbooks always won. The WPA caught some of these voices, 2,900 documents from 24 states. But what about the other 24 states? What about the thousands of elderly Americans who were never interviewed? What about the stories that were told across kitchen tables and front porches and deathbeds in the 1940s and 1950s that no government writer recorded? Those stories passed to grandchildren who are now in their 80s and 90s. The last human chain connecting us to first-hand memory of whatever existed before the transition. The timeline isn't subtle. The 1850s through the 1870s, the old world architecture stands everywhere. Oversized doorways, impossible construction, buildings scaled for someone other than us. The 1871 fires simultaneously destroy cities across 3 states in a single night. The 1890 census captures 62.9 million names during the transition, then the only copy is stored without backup for the first time in American history. The 1890s, the photographs of giants stop appearing. The skeleton discoveries stop being reported. The maps are quietly redrawn. The 1893 White City is built, displayed, and demolished. The orphan trains finish relocating 250,000 children with severed identities. The 1921 fire damages the census. The 1933 order destroys what's left. The 1936 WPA project scrambles to interview the last witnesses. It's defunded 3 years later. By the 1950s, the last Americans who saw the old world with their own eyes are gone, and their grandchildren choose silence because the alternative is too enormous to process. The Library of Congress still has those 2,900 documents, transcribed testimonies from Americans who lived through whatever this was. They've been publicly available since the 1970s. They're searchable, they're readable, and I have to wonder, has anyone gone through every single one? Has anyone searched them for the details that don't fit? For the memories that contradict the official record? For the specific descriptions of buildings, fires, proportions, and technologies that the textbooks say never existed? Because the last Americans who remembered are gone. Their grandchildren are almost gone. But the words are still in the archive, and archives don't forget, not even when everyone else agrees to. The buildings remember, even if we don't. The documents preserve what the encyclopedias erased, and somewhere in those 2,900 transcriptions, in the careful handwriting of Depression-era government workers recording the memories of Americans born before the transition, the truth is sitting in a filing cabinet, waiting, the same way it's been waiting for almost a century. For someone willing to read what the last witnesses actually said, instead of what we've been told they should have remembered.